My name is Don Freeman.
And I'm Scott Warr. And today we're going to dive deep with Stefanie Flippin. I'm trying to remember how long ago, it wasn't too long ago, we read an article in Trail Runner magazine called Common Misconceptions in Trail. Sorry, I got to start over. I can't even read the title. Common Misperceptions in Training for Trail and Ultras. This was back in October 17th that Stefanie wrote. And such a well-written article, and we thought, hey, these points that she's making, I think we need to talk about, because if you're a veteran runner, or even if you're especially a newbie runner that may be scared of getting out on the trails, there's some really good myth busting that she does in this article. But before we get into that, let's tell you a little bit about Stefanie if you don't know her. She's a coach. She's a runner, and boy, does she have some remarkable finishes. She, as a professional trail runner and ultra runner, she boasts impressive 3 top 10 fastest 100-mile times ever recorded here in North America for women. In 2021, she made a stunning mark in the ultra running community by winning the USATF 100-mile national championship with a time, get this, Don, with a time of 14:35.
Wow,
that's freaking fast. That's one of the placing her among the top North American achievements of all time. Stefanie not only is a runner, but she dabbles in her professional career as what else but a surgeon. Yeah, she has her medical degree, and she's a foot and ankle surgeon, and so she's busy with that. And because she has all this free time from running and training and being a surgeon, she also is the host of Making Strides podcast, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the episode. But Stefanie, thanks for taking time. You're a busy person, and we feel very grateful that you're able to join us on this episode.
Well, thank you so much, Scott and Don. I was trying to think back, like before hopping on with you guys, when you guys reached out about me coming on. I started listening to Trail Runner Nation many, many years ago. I think like one of the episodes that stands out to me is one that you guys recorded with Michelle Yates, because I actually ended up at the time when I listened to that episode, I think that was before like her hip surgeries and whatnot, but I was currently in just outside Detroit, Michigan, wrapping up my surgical residency. And my husband and I were prepping to move out here to Colorado, just like one town over from her. So yeah, that's like the episode that's like currently at the forefront of my mind. But I've been listening to you guys for a long time. So it's an honor to be here.
Oh, thanks. Well, just to get going, I mean, we know that you're an excellent writer. I think one of your undergraduate degrees is in writing. So
correct, yeah.
Very well trained, and it shows in your articles. But why this topic? Of all the topics in the world about running,
right,
did you want to say, let's talk about misconceptions
totally
in ultra and trail running?
Yeah, I think I was really drawn to write about that topic just because I'm a coach. I'm so fortunate to lead a very diverse group of athletes. And yeah, I feel like my athlete demographic tends to span maybe like 50% road and then 50% trail ultra, similar to how I approach this sport as well. I love both like road trail, and I tend to split my time throughout the year training both. And yeah, I feel like I have so many athletes who reach out to me who are nervous about like making the transition over to trails, or even like maybe they live in a more urban area. They don't even they're like, where do I even go to train for this race if I sign up for it? And yeah, I just felt like other times I had athletes reach out about being like, I completed a marathon, but does that mean that I can, reach for 100-miler? Like, what does the training for that look like? Do I have to like triple my mileage? And similarly, like just to kind of touch over into my experience in the medical world, I've actually spoken with many physicians out there who are well-versed sports medicine doctors, and there is sort of like a paucity in like the knowledge surrounding like what the training actually looks like for trail and ultra runners. I've even had personal experience where a physician of mine that I've seen was like, well, like we need to really, really scale your volume back. So like no more 200-mile weeks for you. And I'm like, wait, hold on a minute. I've never run a 200-mile week in my life. So I don't know. I was just drawn to write this piece because I feel like like to me and to probably all of you guys here too, it's like some of the topics that I wrote about seem really straightforward and because we've been in the sport. But I've just noticed over the years that these types of like misconceptions and misperceptions are actually quite misunderstood by a large population, whether that's athletes, other physicians, and maybe even some other coaches as well.
Let's dive into some of these, and I'll pick one out of the air that I deal with my sister. She lives down in
Sure.
Dallas, Texas, flatter than a pancake,
Yeah.
and I send her pictures. We're very fortunate. We live near the Western States 100 course,
Oh, wonderful.
and so we're able to get out in the mountains. And especially this time of year, I'm taking pictures of the trail and the falling and changing leaves, and she goes, "Ah, I think I would be a trail runner if I didn't live in Dallas." And I go, what does that have to do with anything? You can still trail run. There's still opportunities for you, and you don't have to train every day on
Hmm.
a trail. What do you hear from your athletes as that goes?
And so I'm going to pause quickly, Scott.
Yep.
You did cut out a hair, so I wanted to be sure that I didn't miss like the entirety of your question. I think the last thing I heard was you mentioned your sister lives in Dallas, but you live right off the Western States course. And then there was like a brief pause, and then I heard you say like, do we need to run on trails every day? So I just wanted to be sure I wasn't missing anything.
Yeah, I think that's the basic gist. I'm going to switch
Okay.
my internet real quick to a different network if I can.
Stephanie, I think he's talking about myth number 2. You have to
Okay.
live by a mountain to succeed as a trail
Sure.
runner.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's really.
totally. Yeah, I hear this question quite often. I'll use like a specific example. One of the athletes that I coach, she too lives actually she lives within Fort Worth, Texas, and she actually hired me in order to train her for URA 50. As you guys know, like to take on URA 50, living in Fort Worth, Texas, is a huge task. But I always like to say, like, yes, there are steps we can take to get you prepared for it, but there's really nothing that's like totally impossible to get you prepared for a race like that. It takes a lot of creativity. It takes maybe additional time put into the training because, like you mentioned, Scott, like of course, like for you and I, like living in the mountains, being able to like run straight from our front door onto a trail, that makes things so easy, so accessible. But for athletes that don't live near the mountains, there are many, many ways to simulate training and to get the body prepared for it. Now, it might look like a lot of hill repeats on the same hill if you have like a local trail system, but the hill is maybe like short. So you might lose that aspect of like sort of getting lost in the mountains, maybe running a big loop or like a point to point course. You might lose that aspect of training and the sort of ability, like I said, to get lost in that run and really be able to like zone out and enjoy things. But I think if someone is dedicated to taking on a trail or mountain race, you don't have to live right in the mountains in order to prepare yourself for it. Some of the things that I've done, especially for like the athlete that I use the example of going from Fort Worth, Texas to being ready for URA 50. And URA 50, I believe, has, what does it have? It has over 20,000 feet of gain in 50 miles, maybe like 23,000 feet. For her, we actually utilized like parking garages. We did a lot of stair work within the stadium, and we did a lot of strength work, lower body strength work, just to get like those eccentric contractions going within her quads. And yeah, like I said, there's many ways to skin the cat to get ready for a race such as that.
Don, didn't you say you had a comment?
No. I waved it off. I was going to explore. This is where editing comes in nice, Ryan. Thanks. I was going to go into some of those options. What can is
Yeah.
treadmill on a hill? Repeats up and down
Right.
stairs, all that good stuff. But yeah, that was an obvious next question for those living in flatland. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I will say, I remember the first time I really experienced the Western States course as a runner. I was pacing a gentleman from New York, actually lived in New Jersey, but worked in New York, very flat. And he got ready for Western States by finding a big skyscraper and
Yeah.
running stairs.
Stairs, yeah, for sure.
So there's all sorts of things that you can do there.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely agree. Yeah, I mean, having access to a treadmill that you can like really jack that incline up is also obviously very, very helpful. But yeah, I feel like I do try to strike a good balance with athletes who maybe like are like, yeah, I know like getting the vert in is important and I can probably simulate like a similar type of vert by staying on the treadmill with the incline jacked up. But I try to strike a good balance too, like your example right there, Scott, of like utilizing different environments just so the athlete isn't feeling like they're just like a hamster on a treadmill, like training for like an incredible outdoor race. But yeah, like tons and tons of different ways.
And I think one of the things you have to do is if you use that method, if you're forced into that because of your environment,
Yeah.
to enter the contest with confidence that, you know
Yeah.
what, even the people that had a mountain in their backyard, they're hurting right now too. This isn't easy for them. Their legs are burning. They're trying to find some oxygen
Yep.
somewhere. And so just having confidence that you've done what it takes, you've had the
Yeah.
right process and in your plans in motion. So go get it done and get to the top so you have some downhill.
Yeah. Completely agree.
Of the other misconceptions that you wrote on the article, we want to hit all of them.
Sure.
But what's one of the most common of the ones that you wrote about that you hear?
Yeah. I feel like probably the most common one is like totality of volume. Most athletes who want to dive into the trail, and I say trail and ultra world, that is something that I touched on in the piece, and we'll definitely dive into that as well. But yeah, those athletes who want to go further than a marathon, I feel like the most common question I get asked is like, well, like maybe I'm injury prone, or I have a history of, like my body just breaking down once I get over, like 40 to 50 miles per week. I don't think I can handle 100-mile weeks. And I'm always like, let's stop right there, because there's no reason why any specific athlete absolutely has to run super, super high mileage in order to be successful at ultras. I'm definitely a coach and physician that's in the camp of approaching training by training hours per week. And then obviously like shrinking that down on a day-to-day basis, runs by time. The science tells us that our body really doesn't know mileage. It's a much better metric at this point. Honestly, in order to prevent like running related injuries as well, and just to prevent burnout, to approach things by time. So I do like to try to pivot the athlete to thinking about okay, like on a day-to-day basis, like it would be great if we could get in like an hour of like aerobic running, maybe one day of hill strides, a third day of maybe like more focused like hill interval work, where we're maybe touching on threshold effort, and like building our way up to longer and longer hill intervals, and then again structuring their long runs in terms of time on feet as well. Yeah. And so I do like to have that conversation, and also just like calm the athlete and be like, there are tons of professional trail and ultra runners out there who span a very wide range of totality in mileage. I mean, I do like to use the example of like a good friend, Claire Gallagher. She's, in the past has been very open about her overall mileage and not actually being a high mileage athlete. I believe in her lead up, when she did win Western States a few years back, I think she had taken even like a week off, like around like peak week time, to prioritize her dedication to research, in another country, surrounding like environmental impacts. And then she had mentioned like, topping out at like 65 miles per week. Of course, every athlete's different. Every athlete's going to respond to different training stimuli in unique ways. But we have someone like Claire, and then on the opposite end of the gamut, I mean, sometimes we've seen, someone like Jim Walmsley, even like Camille Herron, like putting up numbers that are like in the high 100s, and really teetering with that like 150 to 170 mile per week range. And that's such a huge span. And there's nothing to say that any athlete has to do that. Like I said, at the professional and elite level, where athletes are reaching for the very top and the best of the best, sure, maybe they've demonstrated that type of volume works for them, and they've been able to like musculoskeletally handle that type of load. But for the majority of athletes looking to transition over into ultra running, that's simply not needed. And the risk versus reward is much too high to try to reach for those types of numbers. So I would say that is the most common question that I'm asked, especially with athletes. I mean, most athletes that are wanting to make this transition are working full time. They have families, they have very full lives. And myself as a coach, I'm always pushing the fact that like your identity, like we don't want to just turn it into like 100% running. I want you to maintain all the other things that make you you. I want to respect like your family time, the time with your kids, the time with your partner. And yeah, there's no need for us to really like push the volume to an extent that just buries the athlete.
Boy, on your high mileage mandatory comment, and I agree with you, it's important just to build a strong body that can handle
Totally.
that 100-mile distance. And that you may be a stronger body by mixing in some biking and some swimming and some
100%.
weights. And building that body is a perfect vehicle to go down the mountain or up the mountain. But to show up at the starting line beat up because you've got a gazillion miles on it is not the way to go. At least I found that in my experience.
Completely agree. Like rested is always going to be better. Rested and healthy is always best. Right. I think you guys will actually really enjoy like the brief little teaser here. I think you guys will really enjoy the piece that I put out with Trail Runner Mag this month for November. It does touch on how to build fitness without like reaching for a ton of high volume like running, and how to incorporate cross training for different demographics of athletes.
Don't change your number. We'll have to revisit that. Yeah. What percentage? What percentage of runners do you think, just intuitively, just a best guess estimate, that show up to the start line fresh and ready, versus with a niggle or two?
I think that number is slim to none. Honestly, I can tell you, I think especially as we're seeing this uptick in the sport. There's more sponsors, there's more media, there's more spotlight in trail and ultra running, which is incredible. Like we all love to see it. But I do think that with that, there's a lot more pressure for athletes, especially those who are maybe, we're seeing this trend in NCAA athletes coming straight out of college and signing pro contracts that are like for trail teams. We're typically seeing them focusing on short distance, which makes sense. But like I feel like there's more money, there's more sponsorships available at this point, and those sponsorships are offering more money than I would assume that they were offering, 10, 15, 25 years ago. So I feel like there's a lot of pressure, especially, and I'm referring to the more like sub-elite to professional athletes here. I do think, though, that there's this pressure to do more and more and more. Maybe that also has to do with the different races, and the different organizations and all of that sort of, there's a lot of like drama within that sphere right now. And I do feel like we're seeing like Strava numbers just climb and climb and climb. I'll give a great example. One of my close friends and teammates, Leah Yingling, she recently did the double this year from Western States into UTMB, the full lap. And we had a long conversation about how like she had to put blinders up and not scroll through competitors' Stravas, looking at their total volume per week, their total vert per week. And her focus, her and I also share the same coach, Megan Roach, but her focus was to purely recover from Western States, ease back into things, like just maintain the fitness that she had built for Western States, and then get on the start line of UTMB healthy and most importantly, rested. And we saw her have very consistent performances, like 9th at Western States, and then 8th at UTMB. Just the consistency there, she nailed the goal. Where, I think some of her other female competitors, her and I were just following along. It was like, yeah, I think they got to the line at UTMB very overcooked and probably like emotionally overstimulated as well. I mean, when you're going after these types of races where, like I said, there's more media, there's more attention, there's more money surrounding it. Like I said, I just think it becomes this issue of reaching for more and more and more. And there's such a risk and a line to toe with that.
I remember an old saying. This came from probably one of our mentors or one of Don's mentors, that for ultra running, it's about time on feet.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you need to be on the trail. It doesn't
Agree.
need to mean that you're running. It could be that you're at a standing desk.
Yeah.
And that will that will help your fitness. And then I thought back, and I can't remember, Don, who told us this story. I did look it up on the internet, and so we know it's 100% right. But we learned about the 100 ups. Do you remember that, Don?
We did that.
And Stephanie, do you know what? Do you remember the 100 ups?
I don't think I don't recall off the top of my head.
According to the internet that I looked up, and I don't know who this runner is, but a guy named Walter George in 1874. He was a miler, so not a long distance runner, but I think as I remember this story, he was in the military and just crazy busy, and so he would stand at his desk. He did a desk job, and he would do this thing where it was 100 ups, where he would act like he was running. So he would pick one knee up and hold it, and then take one knee up, so the knee was hip high.
Sure.
And he would do that in groups of 100 throughout the day. And so even though he wasn't out running, he could improve on his fitness that way. So I think there's a lot of different options available than just getting into the mountains, onto the trail for a gazillion miles a week. I think that's a huge, huge misconception.
Totally. You're like, just a brief pop in here is that what you just mentioned actually reminded me of sort of how I approached my own training when I was in my surgical residency.
Right.
I mean, I was logging so many hours in the OR. Sometimes surgeries would be lasting 3-4 hours long, even longer sometimes. And then I'm going from floor to floor, seeing patients, running around, running up and down the stairs. And yeah, I wasn't able to get my mileage outside of that sphere of my life up quite as high as I would have liked. But that time on feet absolutely still counted. I coach a lot of athletes in healthcare, and I always remind them of that. So many registered nurses who are working, 3 to 4 12-hour shifts per week. And I'm that's actually very specific training for ultras. And we certainly count that as part of your training.
Hey, Stephanie, it just occurred to me, you've been working in this medical field. What do the doctors think about ultra running? Do they think it's the stupidest thing you could ever do to your body and it's just breaking down your body, or do they think it's healthy?
Yeah, I feel like the majority of my colleagues and just other attendings that I had throughout my training were you are nuts. You're crazy. You're in this very tiring field, and then you're using this also very tiring sport on the side as a foil to what you're doing day to day. They're this doesn't make sense. Yes, of course, I heard that classic, you're gonna just wear your knees down, wear all the cartilage in your hips off as well. But I think over the years, and as I've had more and more colleagues ask me questions and become more familiar with my coaching and just all the different things that I've been able to accomplish over the years, I think there's been more of an understanding of okay, this isn't something that's just a sickness for people. But yeah, I do feel I had to sort of knock away a lot of misconceptions and myths about the sport, particularly with the 100-mile distance sort of being my specialty.
And on that, go ahead, Scott.
Nope.
Yeah, on that point of people getting hip replacements, knee replacements, etc. You don't necessarily see a lot of ultra runners sitting in those chairs. Their ligaments have thickened and their cartilage has become more dense. Their bone density is there. The supporting musculature is developed. So we roll into this and condition ourselves. So many of these people that are receiving these replacement parts are people that haven't used them. And then they just 100%. They wear out. There's a lot of genetics to it, no doubt.
Yep.
But
I totally agree. I'm always, there's a very landmark study out there about runners and arthritic knees and the, incidence of knee replacements. And the literature is damning that unless you have, like you mentioned, Dawn, a genetic predisposition, or you enter the sport with pre-existing arthritis in that joint, the sport of running is not going to make it worse. In fact, it's only going to increase the articular joint fluid in the area and help stave off arthritic development. But of course, that's not like the sexy thing to talk about.
No, but it should be a future article that you write.
Be.
Maybe you've written one. Yeah, that's a great one coming from you with the credentials to back it up. Scott and I could write it, but it wouldn't get too far. If you wrote it, we'd read it.
Yeah.
Hey, let's jump to another one. This is one that I hear all the time, and it's mostly because people are watching me, and that is training for ultras or trail runs will make you slow. And, and obviously, I'm slower now than when I first started running.
Sure.
What do you think about that? If someone is a road runner and they have accomplished great things on marathons and they are maybe a little apprehensive to go to trails because the times are so much slower, what do you tell them?
Yeah, how I like to approach this question is I like to, especially if the athlete has a background, and I know not every athlete has a background in track and field, but I do like to utilize the example of well, of course, a 100-meter sprinter, to them is going to think the paces for a 1500 is slow. And they're going to think that the paces for a 5K and a 10K on the track are even slower. And we hear it constantly too with jokes that track athletes make about oh yeah, I guess I'm going to age out and go to marathons. And really my point there in utilizing that example with athletes is that it's perspective and it's all relative. And depending on the type of ultra that the athlete's targeting, I mean, there's such a wide array within the sport. Are they targeting the most mountainous, 50 miler, 100K or 100 miler out there? Or are they targeting something that's maybe something like JFK 50, where, they spend the first 20 to 25 miles on the AT, and then they're on the tow path and a flat path to bring it into the finish. So I use those different types of examples to be well, what race are we targeting? Because that's going to dictate what the training for it's going to look like. And I'm also the type of coach that's of the mindset that just because we're training for trail and ultra doesn't mean that we don't ever do any type of strides. It doesn't mean that we don't ever touch on threshold work or roughly half marathon effort. Of course, this is always case dependent. It's always dependent on the athlete's, overall fitness, their running history, their background, their age too. I'm certainly not prescribing any type of VO2 max work for my master's athletes in the context of 100 miler, outside of light strides. But yeah, I do like to use that example of it's all perspective. And as long as you continue to utilize and train different systems and also periodize your training, they're not going to necessarily make you slow. The caveat being is that if you just jump from 100K to 100 mile cycles over and over and over again, and you never back off, you never do any type of speed work, you never run any type of shorter races that are challenging a different system, then yeah, I mean you're probably going to lose a bit of turnover there, but that's a little bit more common sense.
As you're talking through this, Stefanie, I'm reminded of a couple of our friends and frequent guests here on the podcast. Ian Sharman, I believe, just set a PR in his marathon. He did, yeah. He's run over 100 trail example. And ultras, and yet he's still fast. He's setting a PR marathon time. Mike Wardian, same thing. I mean, he's racing every single week. Yeah. And it's, even though he's running, some marathons, I think he's preparing for I can't remember which race right now, but I mean, he's a fast runner, even though he gets on the trail. So
yeah. And
good point.
Yeah, I completely agree with utilizing both Ian and Mike as examples there. I think there's so much benefit in utilizing shorter distance road races as workouts, as incredible training stimuli within a training block, even if it's for something like a trail or mountain 100. I'll use myself as an example. I say this past summer, but actually every summer I hop into 1 or 2 road 10Ks. I like to get that type of turnover going. I run them pretty much at all out effort. I live up here at altitude, so I'm kind of cardiovascularly limited by, running. I'm at this point in time up here, I'm chasing altitude PRs. I can't necessarily hit sea level PRs up here anymore. But yeah, I do that every summer. As long as I'm healthy, I do feel like it's an enormous training stimulus and boost for me as I head into, getting a little bit more specific for longer races later on into the fall. fall. And I think to being able to touch on those different types of efforts and being an athlete who has a wide range, and that doesn't mean that like you should be always aiming to PR your 5K and then in a few months you're aiming to PR your 100-miler, but just having the ability to touch on those different type of efforts and train the body that it doesn't have to go into panic mode with one or the other, I think is really beneficial.
Well, I really like your comment about training systems, and that's a fantastic topic for another day of looking to plug those in into your schedule, because it is making sure every system, because when you're out there on a long race, you're going to use those systems somewhere.
You are.
That one hill climb might have been that system that you have been neglecting and not training.
Right.
And so before we get to this next topic, I want to reserve time with Scott that I have 3 myth busters for the surgeon that we have for ankles and feet. So leave time for that. And they're going to be ones that you can knock out of the park, no doubt. But I want to think and talk about the road runner that says, you know what? I'm a little apprehensive about these technical downhills. They're scary. Maybe they're impossible. I'm going to catch a toe and that's the end of my life.
Yep. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Don.
No, so you put this on your list for a good reason. Okay. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. No, this is such a common fear. I would label this as a fear that like most road athletes come to me with, that are like, I really want to get more comfortable on the trails. I want to like line up at this like trail 50K, but I'm petrified of like technical trails and especially technical downhills. The first thing I always bring up, like as me as a coach and just as a human being, is that I was in your shoes. Like, seriously, like I was frightened. Like I remember just like tiptoeing down with like the worst type of form, leaning back, just like straining my quads so much. And so that's the first thing I say, is that you are not alone in this. And I think that's really important, so that no athlete ever feels like they're the only ones, or that they're just siloed in this fear of technical descending. And then the second thing I bring up is, what types of trail shoes are you running in? I think for me personally, that has become like, I had like a light bulb moment where I had labeled myself at one point as like, I'm a great climber. I can like out climb anyone. I can run forever, but like, I'm going to get passed on the technical downhills, because I just like, I'm a surgeon. Also, I work with my hands. I don't want to break a wrist. Like that's going to take me out from that line of my work. I also just don't want to like knock some teeth out. It's scary. But I do like to cover what types of shoes athletes are wearing, especially in this era right now where we're seeing more and more like maximal cushion shoes. And especially on the trails, as well as like carbon plated trail shoes. These are technologies that like we just didn't really have like, 10, 15 years ago. So yeah, I like to have that discussion, because sometimes, and a lot of the athlete's fear can stem from being in a shoe that's not confidence inspiring for them. If they can't feel the trail, or if the foam in the shoe is a little bit too bouncy, or again, like if they're in like a carbon plated trail shoe, the athlete might not be able to sort of like hunker down on those technical descents and find the most efficient way to descend in like the straightest sort of line possible. And I feel like that's when we start to see athletes do that like side to side motion, where they're trying to like avoid every single rock and route, as opposed to like running over the terrain. My coach, Megan, has also used the example of like taking the approach of like viewing your feet as like little monster trucks on the trail, so that like you're going over all of the terrain, and like a monster truck doesn't like hop from side to side to avoid all of the terrain. But I do feel like that little visualization tactic there can be helpful. So going over shoes with them to be sure that they're feeling confident. And then the third thing is, I don't ever just start athletes on like technical descending. It's not one of those things where you just throw an athlete like at the top of a hill and be like, run as fast as you can down it. And the more times we do this, you're going to get over it. So what I have athletes typically do is I have them start like hill strides, like I've mentioned, are definitely a staple in the training that I prescribe to athletes. But for athletes who maybe are having like just like quad strength issues, or they're very fearful of technical descending, I have them do downhill strides. They can do this. I prefer this on like a dirt road if possible, on like a decline. But if the athlete only has like road available to them, you can also do this if your treadmill has a decline. But there is like a limiter of speed on the treadmill. So typically outside is going to work better for this. But yeah, I have the athlete do downhill strides on non-technical terrain to ease them into things. And I really have them focus on form here, a forward lean, like from the ankles, and really focusing on quick, fast feet, as well as like, I mean, when you're on a road, you don't necessarily have to choose an efficient line down, but I have them focus on the fact that they are moving in a linear way. There's no excessive movement from side to side, and there's no wasted energy there. Similarly, when I have these athletes do downhill strides, I also have them practice like where they feel most confident, like moving their arms and their upper body. We see a lot of like the best like technical descenders in the world. You can just picture Killian in that like classic video, like coming down like a talus field. His arms are usually like lifted up from his side to help sort of like steady his center of gravity. I have athletes like pull up those videos like on YouTube, and I'm like, watch how these athletes like watch what their body looks like when they're navigating this type of technical terrain. And I have them try to emulate it on non-technical terrain first so that they can get confident with that form. And then from there, I slowly have them start adding in more and more technicality until we've hit a point where we're sort of successfully mimicking the type of terrain that their, goal race has.
Stefanie, I don't know if you ever remember, it wasn't too many years ago, maybe just a couple years ago, Hoka made a shoe called the 10-9.
Yes. Yeah, I do remember that.
Ugly shoe in the whole world. Right. And Don had a pair, and he says, Scott, you have got to try these. And I go, yeah, it's going to make me look like I have a size 20 on my shoe. This is how the theory of Bigfoot got started. They were just gigantic with this tail.
That posterior flare, yeah.
Don allowed me to try them on, and we started at the top of this hill, and he says, just start taking it easy, and then as you feel comfortable, just let go. And probably after what, Don, 30 seconds, he was videoing this. It's a fun video to watch that he and I share. I took off like a bat, and I was down the hill out of sight within a couple minutes.
Yeah.
And the shoe was created comfort, not it made you comfortable in that terrain.
Yeah.
And so I think you're right on the run. Maybe the 10-9 isn't manufactured, sure, but I think you need to find a shoe that you feel comfortable and confident in.
100%. Yeah. I honestly, like, I start there before I even talk about like form or anything like that. Because if the athlete doesn't feel confident in the shoes that they're in, like it's game over, right? Like you're never going to be able to pick it up if you're like, the shoe makes me feel like I'm going to like continuously roll my ankle, or if the athlete like can't feel any of the trail underfoot. Again, I know this is probably coming off like I'm like anti max cushion. I'm not, because like some athletes really benefit from that based on their injury history or just like their comfort on the trails. But like shoe gear on the trails really is such an important factor. I feel like, especially as it pertains to technical descending.
We're talking downhill, and one of the things that was passed on to me from a good downhiller is you've got to reach out with your eyes and look ahead of you. If you're looking right down where your toes are, you can't run fast like that.
It's too late. Yep.
You're never going to get fast there. You have to have a step or two ahead of you and start mapping your course. And I'll give this credit to Julie Fingar, who's a race director out here and a very good trail runner. And she would say going downhill is like dancing. You've got to pick your spot, find your spot, set your foot where it needs to go, look ahead to the next spot, and just move fluidly down the hill.
Yeah, totally. I like to give two examples to athletes that are very much in line with what you just mentioned, Dawn, of yes, like dancing down the trail. And also I like to tell athletes who are afraid of technical descending that technical descending, or even just descending in general, is like the play aspect of trail running. And if we can reframe it and relabel that, like their fear of it in terms of like, oh, this is play, it's light. Like I used to like feel like this as a kid, like on the playground, or like with an athlete in the background with a background in dance, like things like that. It can really like flip a switch for the athlete and be like, oh yeah, this isn't scary. This is like an opportunity for me to pick up my feet, not have like that classic like run form or like grinding uphill. So yeah, I find that helpful. The other example I like to use, as you mentioned, like needing to look ahead of you and not write down where your feet are. I had a mentor in residency who told me that like in surgery, oftentimes like if you can't get the incision like open wide enough, a lot of times you have to use your hands as like your second pair of eyes in order to like feel a certain part of the joint or locate an anatomical landmark like within the incision site. And to me, I like to utilize that example for your feet, especially going downhill. Your feet are also like your second pair of eyes, like, and that's why I do feel it's important to be able to feel a certain degree of the terrain. You can feel the rocks under you, but if you're steering down right where your feet are, like we said, Dawn, it's like already too late, and you've probably already taken a spill.
Hey, let's move on. Let's move on to another misconception, and I'm gonna throw Don and I a big mirror that we have to look at in the mirror because we've been accused of this at Trail Runner Nation podcast.
Wait,
that
Scott,
we talk about.
Don't include me. Don't include me on this. I haven't approved of this. Go ahead.
Well, it's called Trail Runner Nation, but a lot of times we talk about ultras.
Yes.
Is trail running ultra running?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I've heard like this conversation and this sort of like debate like more recently, just like between certain athletes who are maybe more inclined to focus on like road ultra running versus trail, and like this conversation here. To me, and others might disagree, but to me, like trail running can be any type of distance. It can be a 3K trail race. It can be a 5K trail race. It can be a kid's 400-meter like race on a trail, and it can go all the way up to like Tahoe 200, Cocodona 250, that are 250 miles like on a trail. To me, that's what trail running is, and it's inclusive in terms of the distance. You can absolutely be a trail runner without ever running like longer than a marathon. And again, like the best examples I could use for this is, look at some of our nation and our world's like best like short distance trail athletes. They are absolutely ripping like 10K distances, these like vertical Ks, things like that, and the distances are short. They're not ever even going over 50K or even like marathon sometimes. To me, that's like the definition of trail running. And then ultra running, it can be any surface. It's just referring to the distance. So anything longer than 26.2 miles, we usually classify that as a 50K or beyond. But yeah, interestingly, I did choose to list that in the piece because that is something that I hear quite often.
Yeah.
I'm someone that's huge on accessibility and like making the sport as inclusive as possible. So I tend to shy away from the more like polarized takes on this, where it's like, no, you're only a trail athlete if you've run a 50K at least, because I feel like that's discouraging to athletes who are looking to make the switch. And also like, sometimes like depending on like your age or your like life demands, like sometimes athletes like don't want to run that long, like, and that's perfectly fine and respectable. So yeah, that's my take on it.
What about the enthusiastic trail runner that feels like, well, heck, I need that buckle because that's what everybody posts on social media. Sure. How long should a person wait to run that distance? And your second season, third season. But I want to start with saying this. It really depends on who the person is. Have they been a hiker? Have they been involved in soccer for many years, or they always just been on the couch? So there's that caveat. But how long should I wait? I've just finished a marathon. I want to jump to 100. Should I?
Yeah, you know what? I like to have a conversation with those types of athletes about the time that they have available to put into training and like the reality of that. I'm never someone that takes like a black and white approach. If an athlete comes to me and has experience as a road runner, and they've at least done a road marathon, that's typically like my like bare minimum there. If an athlete has like never run a marathon before and they're wanting to just like leap into like, a 100-miler or 100K, I'm like, I do think it is important to experience like sort of the highs and lows of a marathon first, not just from like an athletic standpoint, from like being on your feet, but honestly from a fueling perspective. Like fueling is like, as we know, it's like the keystone of like, being out on the trails and running these longer distances. So I do sort of want to be like, let's nail fueling within the context of a marathon first. But for an athlete that has done that and is looking to jump in, I do like to build in like a 50 miler within that athlete's training in the lead up to a 100 miler. I don't prescribe that for every athlete within their training block. If they're training for a 100 miler, I don't make every single athlete of mine race like a 100 or a 50 miler in the lead up. But for athletes who are making that significant leap in distance from, say, marathon, even sometimes 50K to 100 miles, I do think it's important to zoom out and potentially choose a 100-mile race that gives you enough time to really build into the distance, and that also affords you the amount of time and flexibility to get in a 50-mile race. Sometimes for my more durable athletes, like especially for like my higher level male athletes looking to make this leap, I will have them run like 100K in the lead up just to get like a little bit more experience with that sort of time on feet. Again, not a requirement, but I think there's a lot of benefit in working through, a 50-mile day if you're looking to make that leap from the marathon to the 100-mile distance.
I'll probably get accused of just repeating what you said, but I don't think it's the musculoskeletal system or the cardiovascular system in question.
No.
It's being able to solve those problems that come at you. That's the real. Yep. That's what you need the longer distance for to learn those lessons.
Yep, I completely agree.
Yep. And people
there's so much benefit in that.
People don't miss out because my musculoskeletal system wasn't ready. That's not why you ended up losing the bib or the band on your arm. It was you didn't know how to solve that problem. You didn't see it coming, and it ran over you, and now you're still on the ground. So there you go.
I completely agree with you, Don. There's so much benefit in sort of like being with yourself and like sitting within discomfort, and not just like from like a quote David Goggins perspective, but like you said, from a decision making perspective, like troubleshooting and like having that understanding of like, oh shoot, like I didn't take a gel or I didn't eat that salted potato like 25 minutes ago, and now I'm feeling not so great. Like my hands are getting really swollen. My toes are starting to cramp up, and just like working through all of that, understanding like how to keep yourself safe, how to make good decisions, how to pull yourself through low spots, and also how to manage like high points during the race as well.
Mm-hmm. Good. It reminds me, I just in recent years, maybe the last half a dozen years, more of the race directors have been offering shorter distances along with their premier distance. Yeah. A 10K, a 5K. Yeah. And I think that's really nice for people that are nervous about trails, getting first into trails and the technical aspect of it, and trying out new shoes and working your way up in mileage so that you can learn those lessons of either emotional, mental, or biological issues that you can have out on the trail.
Yeah, 100%. And just to like tack on to that, I any like race directors that I'm so fortunate to have conversations with, I always ask if they don't have shorter distance options, I always ask if it's possible to implement them, because additionally, if they're already putting on a longer distance, it affords them the ability to offer a shorter distance race, but with virtually like no like cutoffs. And I do feel like the cutoffs can also be a very intimidating factor for a lot of athletes who are looking to transition onto the trails. And if I could go back and like add a little editor's note to this piece that I wrote for Trail Runner, I would probably add that, just like the misconception, not the misconception, but just like the fears surrounding cutoffs, and just listing perhaps like different race directors or organizations that are really, really good about offering shorter distance races while a longer distance is going, so that removes that issue. Typically for most people, it removes the issue of missing cutoffs.
You brought up David Goggins in that comment, and sure. I spend most of my day out there trying to avoid a David Goggins moment. I mean, that's
I hear you.
That's what you want to avoid of needing that kind of internal dialogue.
Totally.
Solve those problems.
I know. Yeah, I mean, maybe another misconception out there too is like, again, I know that can be a polarizing topic with the David Goggins mindset. I certainly respect him as a human, but again, like we're saying, Don, like ultra running, I think like it doesn't have to be like torture. It doesn't have to be self-imposed torture, and that's not the point of it. And sort of getting folks who aren't familiar with it to understand that. It's a huge conversation with many moving pieces.
Yeah, very good comment.
Good point.
Scott.
Hey, before we end the podcast, I promised Don that he could ask you three. What was it, Don? 3 questions, 3 myths. What was it?
Yeah, well, we have our time in the doctor's office. We don't want to waste out on anything. Can you look at this, doc?
Sure.
What do you think? And
sure.
And so these are my 3. You covered one of them very well in the discussion, which was a minimalist shoe versus maximal. I mean, that would be, from the foot perspective, from the doctor perspective, proprioception, feeling the trail. What's your thought on that?
Yeah. Again, like as you guys have probably noticed here, I never mean to come off sounding like I'm a politician, but I always say like it truly depends. And one thing that works for someone, it might not work for the other person. Something that I tell athletes as well as just like friends and family, if you go into a doctor's office and they are very, very black and white on a topic such as minimal versus like max cushion shoes, that is a red flag to me. No practitioner should ever be so polarized on this specific topic because everyone's different. Everyone has different anatomy. Everyone has different injury pattern history. A little tidbit that I don't know, like that the bulk of your listeners may know, is that if you are someone that has had chronic knee pathology, such as like IT band syndrome, the classic like patellar tendon, runner's knee, anything like that at all, even like any type of like quad strains, those aren't like super common, but anything that's surrounding the knee joint, you would technically benefit from going into a slightly lower drop shoe. When I say lower drop, I mean the stack height of the heel compared to the stack height of the forefoot. So best case example here, Ultra, their shoes are all at this point a 0 drop. I know they just recently introduced a 4 millimeter drop shoe. You don't necessarily have to go into a 0 drop shoe if you have IT band syndrome or any other knee pathology. But if you're running in a more traditional shoe, say something like a Brooks Ghost, that's I believe like a 10 to 12 millimeter heel to toe drop, you're putting a lot of excess strain on the patellofemoral joint, and going into something that's more of like a 6 millimeter drop, if you can tolerate it, like gradually like building down into that, it's going to take a lot of the stress off of the knees. We can also use the flip side of that. Athletes who maybe have had a history of intrinsic, and by intrinsic I mean within the foot, and ankle issues like maybe like metatarsal, like not necessarily stress reactions, but things like maybe if you have like an inflamed neuroma, if you have like chronic plantar fasciitis that you've been just like nothing is helping for it, going into a slightly higher heel to toe drop shoe, if you're currently in a very low drop shoe, can help take the biomechanical stress off of the foot and the ankle.
In the beginning of your article, you said through Livestrong, I think it was the reference.com, that 1 out of every 5 runners is trail runner. And so I started thinking about that drop that you were talking about during the conversation, that if you're running on a flat road that's very predictable, every step's the same, that drop has a big variable, right? But we're on the trail. It's very, very rare that we're on a long flat surface like that. Do you think there's that much difference then for us?
Good question.
Yeah. Don, I do think that it can stack up over time, just based on like time on feet on the trail. You're right though, that the terrain is so much more variable that you might not feel the same exact like maximum benefit of making that transition if you're someone that has had it, like I mentioned, like IT band syndrome, patellofemoral syndrome, and you're running in a higher, like a more traditional heel to toe drop shoe and you transition into a lower one. I do feel like for the trails, again, I don't like tell every athlete this, but I do think for most people, being in a middle of the road heel to toe drop shoe in a trail shoe is going to be of most benefit. Like something in like the 4 to 6 millimeter range. 4 millimeters is technically more on the low side, but that's sort of like average middle ground place, I think is going to benefit most people on trails, honestly, from a stability standpoint. And it, like we mentioned with technical descending, that confidence inspiring standpoint. If you're in a shoe that's like just more traditional, you might not be able to get sort of like the foot dexterity that you need. Additionally, some athletes like just cannot tolerate being in a 0 mm drop shoe when you're on the trail because there's so much more incline and going like up and down, and it just puts a lot of excess strain on the Achilles complex.
Good. Now, doctor, I hear the front desk coming to try to clear this room. So
Sure.
maybe just a sentence or two on these next two topics.
Sure.
Should we even concern ourselves about heel striker, forefoot striker? Is there anything to that, or is that
Great
10 years
question.
ago that was go?
Great question. Everyone's unique. Everyone's anatomy, like I said, their biomechanics is unique. Unless you have a glaring biomechanical imbalance that's been diagnosed by a gait specialist that is attributing to a significant and like chronic injury, that is really the only time that I have athletes like significantly focus on foot strike if it's applicable, like I said, to their gait analysis and what their medical team has recommended to them. Otherwise, if an athlete is very concerned about like their amount of heel strikeage, I usually pivot the athlete to focusing more on their cadence, especially on easy runs. If their cadence is low on an easy run, around like 150 to 160, even if it's like high 160s, low 170, I have the athlete focus more on getting up to that 180 range on their easy runs. And that typically helps it usually helps just naturalize their form, and athletes tend to like midfoot strike more by doing that. And it tends to lessen that overstriding that leads to heel striking.
Last question. Blister, should I pop it during the race? Should I pop it after the race? Should I just leave them alone? What are your thoughts?
Great question. If the blister, you need to look at like the fluid that's within the blister. If it's clear and it's in an area that is weight bearing and you are constantly feeling it, and it's just getting bigger and bigger, yes, it's appropriate to like using a sterile needle, like cleaning the area. It's okay to lance it, but you do need to leave the roof intact. The roof is the top portion of the blister that functions as like your body's built-in Band-Aid to protect the area from getting infected. If you have a significant blood-filled blister, unless it is, like I said, on a weight-bearing surface that is just getting worse and worse and worse, you technically do not want to pop blood-filled blisters. You tend to want to let those absorb and heal on their own, if possible.
Great answers. Thank you.
What's the difference? What causes a blood blister? Why is that?
Yeah, if it's filled with blood, it's much deeper, and there's a lot more ecchymosis or bruising to the subcutaneous tissue. So draining it, it really increases the likelihood of infection because it's a much sort of like deeper flesh wound, essentially.
Now, for the record, that was on Scott's visit. I was done with mine, so tell the front desk it wasn't me.
Sure.
Bill me for that one. Hey, Stefanie, this has been a fun conversation.
It really
It's
has.
really nice to meet you and go through this. You can find more about her freelance writing or coaching and her podcasts at stefanieflippin.com. Of course, it'll be linked in the show notes. Hey, before we leave, tell us a little bit about Making Strides podcast. What is it about? Why should we listen?
Sure. So Making Strides is a podcast that my co-host, Carolyn Sue, she's the founder of Diverse We Run on Instagram. We created the podcast. We have two differing sort of like paths into the sport of trail and ultra running. Carolyn entered the sport from an amateur perspective, and she ran Trans Rockies as her first like major trail race, which is just so incredible.
Wow.
Yeah. And so when Carolyn and I became friends, I was actually at the end of 2020, early 2021, I had just signed my first professional trail and ultra running contract. So I was sort of navigating that world as like a newly professional trail runner. And so we decided to come together and chat about our different experiences in the sport, some of which have been tough conversations. We take on topics that surround like increasing diversity and accessibility and inclusivity on the trails. We talk about our different lived experiences. We have interviewed close friends of ours, like Myrna Valerio, who's just a wonderful human and avid trail runner. We've had discussions with all different types of people about their experiences. And our goal with Making Strides is just to normalize the fact that like this sport is inclusive, it's very diverse, and there is a place for everyone.
Excellent. And you're also a founder of another podcast. We talked before the podcast started. It's called relay.
Yeah.
You're on a break right now because of all the many different balls you're juggling. What is relay? The relay podcast.
Yeah. So relay is, it's like an 8-member podcast, runners from all different walks of life. From myself being in the trail and ultra world, we had Karen Goucher on it, former Olympian. We have like a handful of people that range from someone like Lindsay Hine, who's another awesome podcast host, to like Peter Bromka, who is known for his writing about road marathons. And yeah, each week we have something called a group chat where we take on recent news going on in the running world. We also answer listener questions. I participate in something called a coach's corner, where I also answer listener questions and cover different topics and training theories. And yeah, it's really like honestly a little bit similar to Making Strides, in that like we're just trying to represent everyone like throughout the sport and provide something fun to chat about that speaks to everyone who's involved in running.
And of course you do coaching. Do you have any spots left if anybody was listening to this? Sure. And it sounds like you need something else to do. Can they get a hold of you?
Sure. Yes, I am currently taking on new athletes right now. Honestly, on a case-by-case basis, I am the type of coach that likes to build long-term relationships with my athletes. So yeah, if you're the right fit, please feel free to reach out. I would love to have a conversation with you and help you achieve your goals. And like Scott mentioned, the best place to find me is on my website, StefanieFlippin.com. And I have a great little email function there where we can message each other.
Wonderful.
Great. Stefanie, thanks for joining us and debunking some of these myths.
Sure.
One of the great things about trail running that I just love about our community is what you said earlier. It invites people. Mm-hmm. Everyone is welcome.
Yep.
It's accessible to everyone. Mm-hmm. And if we can help destruct some of these misconceptions, I think that we can get more people out there. And boy, if one of us enjoy it, every one of us can enjoy it. And so thank you for writing the article. I look forward to November's issue and your article in November's issue.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate you having me, Dawn and Scott.
Yeah, thank you.
So go out and run.
Mas.